Today we're going to wrap up our series on the fall and rise of Joseph. Had a little time in between our last message, but that's okay. Today's going to be a good wind-up and kind of like, what's the moral of the story? This whole story of Joseph, what was it leading to? And I think it leads us to one of the greatest lessons that we can actually learn in life. One of the greatest lessons. And what we're going to see today is how to overcome your hurtful past. I've noticed in this life that everyone has a past. I've also noticed that, well, let's face it, some people, they have a real hurtful past. Things have been done to them. Things have been said to them. Things just happen to them. Sometimes just because that's how life works. And because of that, they have some wounds and some scars on their hearts. And I also believe that God has noticed this. God is not unaware of the pains and the wounds and the bruises that we've experienced in life. And He's given us a way to overcome those hurtful pasts. As we've been doing, using the life of Joseph, we'll see that victory is possible. See, that's the beauty of the Christian life. The Christian life, here it comes, it's all about victory. The Christian life, it's not about staying where you are. It's about victory, going on in victory. And it's possible. And it's also a blessing. I want you to see victory as a blessing. That victory is good. But before there's victory, there's going to be a battle. Battle precedes victory. And if you're in a battle right now, that's okay. The victory can be yours. Now, we've seen Joseph's battles, right? Sold into slavery by family, his jealous brothers. Falsely accused of sexual advances by his boss's wife, right? Potiphar's wife. Then he went to jail, forgotten in an Egyptian jail. But all of these things God had allowed to happen. I believe that was Joseph's schoolhouse of learning. And because Joseph was faithful in every one of those instances, it was now time for promotion. See, God had a plan for Joseph's life. And the plan was, that He would use him in a mighty way. But he had to experience some humbling first. Funny thing about being humbled, not ha-ha funny, interesting funny, that it usually takes adverse circumstances to humble us. God wants us to have humility, but He uses adverse circumstances to do it. And when adverse circumstances come into our lives, we can go one of two ways. We can become humble, or we can become prideful. We can be softened, or we can be hardened. We can become better, or we can become bitter. And these are the choices that we all make. But one thing we see with the plan of God, the greater the responsibility, the greater the humility is needed. And Joseph's going to have a great responsibility, and therefore he's going to need some real great humility, and that's why he went through some of the hurtful things that he did. Now, we left off Joseph last time in the Egyptian jail, and remember the Pharaoh had a dream. He dreamed of 7 fat and healthy cows, and they were grazing in the grass. And then 7 skinny cows, ugly cows. They came out of the Nile River, and they ate the 7 healthy cows. Man, what a dream, huh? Like I said, don't eat chorizo before you go to bed. Then he dreamed 7 healthy stalks of grain were growing, and 7 stalks, thin and scorched, they showed up and they ate the healthy stalks of grain. Now, Pharaoh was troubled by these dreams. I guess I would be too. And he called for all of his magicians and his wise men. He said, guys, you got to tell me what's going on here. They didn't know. They couldn't interpret the dreams. And then the cupbearer, remember the cupbearer? He was in jail with Joseph, and he had his own dreams, and Joseph interpreted the cupbearer's dreams. And then finally the cupbearer, because he was restored back to his position, and he heard about the Pharaoh's dreams, he said, oh, wait, there's a guy. There's a guy in jail. I met him. His name is Joseph. He's pretty good at interpreting dreams. He told the Pharaoh. So Pharaoh said, let's get him. And they called for Joseph. And Pharaoh explained the dreams to Joseph. And Joseph told Pharaoh what the dreams meant. He knew. Why? Because he walked with God. See, the cool thing about Joseph, he walked with God even when the average guy would not walk with God. He didn't let adverse circumstances be his defeat. He let them be his teacher. So Joseph told Pharaoh that here's what the dream means. That there's going to be 7 years of abundance. Those are the fat cows. The healthy stalks of grain. But then there's going to be 7 years of famine. These are the skinny cows that ate the big cows. So we pick this up in Genesis 41, if you're following along in the Bible, in verse 32. Now, as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh, twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. So Joseph's saying, listen, this is a God thing, and it's going to happen really soon. He said, so let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Joseph said to Pharaoh, listen, store up the grain to prepare. A famine's coming. Store up enough grain for 7 years, because a famine's going to come, and it's going to last for 7 years. So Pharaoh said, okay, that makes sense. I need to find a guy like Joseph who's in touch with God. And I'm like, wait a minute, Pharaoh, why do you need to find a guy like Joseph when you've got Joseph, right? Why do you need to go find somebody like him? You got the real McCoy. You know, sometimes we go looking for things that we already have. Ever notice that? It's amazing how we have things right in our lives, but we don't recognize them. Maybe we go looking for happiness, but if we stop and look, you know what? We've got happiness. Maybe we go looking for security, but if we stop and look, we've got security. It's funny how we go looking for things that we already have. I think about a church sometimes too. Sometimes churches go outside the ministry to find people that they need, when you know what? The people they need are right in that ministry. They're sitting right there. And they need to be sensitive to the call of God, because God's going to call them to lead the youth, to lead the worship, to teach the word. And they're already sitting right in church, and people have to be keen and discerning and recognize their gifts and say, wow, is God now calling me right now to live in my gift? And we have to respond. So in verse 39, the light went on. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, and there's no one so discerning and wise as you are, Pharaoh's starting to get it now. He not only put Joseph in charge of all the grain, he made him, here it comes, the second in command over the whole kingdom. That's what he did. That was Joseph's promotion. Oh, Pharaoh gave Joseph a lot of power, a lot of authority. I would say that God had a pretty good plan for Joseph, even though he had to go through what he did. And why did Joseph go through what he did? Being almost killed by his brothers, sold to a caravan, thrown into prison. You know why? Because humility must precede responsibility. Joseph had some life lessons to learn, and you know what? He didn't know it. See, when we're prideful, we're usually blind to our pride. We usually are. We don't see it because pride is blinding. But God saw it, so God had to work in Joseph's life to get him to see it. And Joseph learned what he needed to learn, and God gave him a phenomenal promotion. So here's my point. Never give up when God is working in your life. God is working in all of our lives. You know why? Because he loves us. And he wants to bring us to a better place. He's got that in mind, I believe, for all of us. But we've got to be ready for that better place. And you know, that better place is probably something that we haven't even thought of yet. Our mind can't even conceive, maybe, of where God wants to bring us, that we don't even picture ourselves being in that place. But God does. You know, the Bible tells us, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has it even entered into the mind of man, the things that God has prepared for those who love him. I love that scripture, because it tells us that God's plan for our life is not limited by our own short-sightedness. We only see ourselves going so far in life, but God sees us going so much farther. I mean, think about the disciples. They saw themselves as fishermen and tax collectors, and God saw them as world changers. And they did. We're still talking about them today. So now, okay, watch what happens. Jacob, who's Joseph's father, they're all in the famine now, all over that part of the world. And he heard that there was grain in Egypt, and he sent his sons to buy some grain. Now, when the brothers arrived, Joseph recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. I mean, after all, Joseph, he looks like an Egyptian. He probably, I'm sure he did, learn the Egyptian language. And he's a totally different person. They didn't change much, but he did. He's probably speaking to them in Egyptian. And then, you know, a few other things transpired between Joseph and his brothers, and they made a couple of trips back and forth from Canaan to Egypt to buy grain. And then on their last trip to Egypt, we're in Genesis chapter 45 and verse 1, Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, "Have everyone go out from me." And there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He finally revealed to his brothers, "I am Joseph." And you know, the Bible tells us he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. And then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph." What a moment of brokenness. And I'm not even going to think about how the brothers might have felt at that point. And Joseph said, "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers couldn't answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Dismayed, that's probably a polite way of saying it. They were like beside themselves. "What? Joseph, our brother? The one we sold to a caravan? The one we told our father a wild animal ate him, and look, here's his coat? That Joseph?" But see, something miraculous happens. See, here's what's so great about God. He's still in the miracle business. And you know what the greatest miracle God can do, I believe? Change a heart. Changing a heart is more difficult than raising the dead. Changing a heart, that's tough. And yet, you know what? God can do it. And in verse 5, Joseph speaks from his new heart. He's got a brand new heart toward his brothers. And he said to them, "Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves." His old heart would have said, "You dirty rats, I'm prime minister, you guys are going to get it now." But his new heart had taken over. And he said, "Don't be grieved, and don't be angry with yourselves, because you sold me here." Because see, Joseph learned something, and you know what he learned? God sent me here. You guys didn't send me here. God sent me here. And now I know why. To preserve life. God sent me here. God's plan was to put me in charge of all the food. So that little tiny remnant called Israel, 70 people at that time, would come to Egypt and they would be preserved. And that would be the beginning of Israel becoming a great nation. So Joseph said, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. What's a remnant? A remnant means a remainder or a surviving portion. That's what that means. And see, God had a nation in mind, a very special nation. And this nation would provide the Messiah. They would bring the Messiah into the world. And I believe God also had intentions for this nation called Israel to bring the good news all over the world for people to hear. And now today, God uses another entity. He uses the church. The church is the remnant to bring the good news all over the world. If you're in the church of Christ today, then there's a calling on your life. And our lives are to be lived out somehow, some way, in spreading the good news of the Messiah all over the world. So Joseph said, we're in verse 8, now therefore, it was not you who sent me here, even though they did physically. Joseph's thinking beyond that. He's a deep thinker now. He said, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. Joseph learned how to recognize the hidden hand of God in his life. That's something we need to practice. We need to practice God recognizing when God is working in our lives through circumstances and events. And Joseph said, he's made me a father to Pharaoh, not like a legitimate natural father, but someone that is so near and dear to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh trusts him. And he made him lord of over all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh understood. Joseph understood what God had intended for him. You know, I think of the story of David when David was being prepared to be king of Israel. And this little guy came out of nowhere named Shimei. He came out of the woods, and he's throwing rocks at David and spitting at him and throwing dirt and kicking up a fuss because he didn't like David. He was faithful to Saul. And David's captain said, well, I'm going to go cut off his head. Everybody should have a friend like that. A friend that stands up and says, well, I'm going to go cut off their head. But you know what David said? David said, no, leave him alone. What if God told him to do it? To work humility in me. See, that's what made David such a great king. He's a deep thinker. What if God told him to do that to me? To humble me. So I'm not going to interfere with what God is doing, so leave him alone. That's incredible. I don't know anyone else who would have done something like that. I probably would have said, good idea, cut off his head. That's why I'm not king of Israel. So Joseph said, go back and tell our father that I'm alive and that I am Lord of all Egypt. And I want you to come here and I want you to live here. Now the family returned and Jacob lived out his days in Egypt. And you know the great thing? The Pharaoh gave Joseph's family the best land in all of Egypt, the land of Goshen. Oh man, they had the best gardens and the best farms. They had the best of everything. He said, that's going to be for you. That's how much the Pharaoh loved Joseph. So they came back and they came back and they lived, and then Jacob died in Israel. But they brought the remains of Jacob back to his home to bury him, because that was his homeland. And then they returned to Egypt. That's what they did. Okay? Now, the story begins to take a turn. We get to Genesis chapter 50. Verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, we're done. That's my translation. They said, what if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong which we did to him? See, they're thinking, while our father's alive, Joseph's going to tolerate us. But now that he's gone, here comes revenge. What are we going to do? So the brothers also, they came and they fell down before him and they said, behold, we are your servants. Oh, what's that a picture of? Remember Joseph's dreams? Remember when Joseph said he saw bales of hay out in the field and their bales bowed down to his bales? Remember when he said he saw the sun, the moon, the stars in the sky and they bowed down to him? The dream came true. Though I'm not saying it was very graceful for Joseph to flaunt that dream when he did, it was still true. Just because something's true, that doesn't mean we put it in somebody's face. We got to be so careful about that, okay? So they said, we're your servants. And you know what Joseph said to them? And Joseph didn't even play games with them. He simply said to them, don't be afraid, for I am in God's place. He's saying, don't worry. See, when you know that you're right with God, you don't have a vengeful spirit. Joseph didn't have a vengeful. He could have done whatever he wanted to his brothers. He had all the authority. And maybe by sight, they deserved it. He could have put them in jail and let them just rot there. But Joseph understood that God was working in his life. And here's what he said in verse 20. As for you, I know, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. And this is why. To bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. I wonder if that's like the same principle that the Apostle Paul said, death works in me so life can work in you. That we are living sacrifices. So what did Joseph do? You might say he forgave his brothers, but really it's more than that. It's more than Joseph forgiving his brothers. What he did was he demonstrated his deep faith in God. That's what he did. He didn't excuse their evil. He didn't say, you guys, I know you didn't mean it. No, they were bad boys. They were evil. But he saw it as a tool of God. Like Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot was evil, but God used him to get Jesus to the cross to die for our sins. So Joseph's not forgiving them because they're sorry. He's forgiving them because he knows God used them to bless him, to make him a different person, to promote him, to elevate him, to do a work in his life. So forgiveness is one aspect of faith in God. I think that's, there are many ways that we demonstrate faith in God. Forgiving others is one way, right? Jesus said, he said some hard things. Love your enemy, pray for your enemy, forgive those who use you. Peter said, I can forgive somebody 7 times a day. The law says 3. Jesus says, how about like 70? But there's other ways to demonstrate faith in God. Service is a way we demonstrate faith in God. Being generous with what we've got is another way that we demonstrate faith in God. Being kind, being the helper, being a servant. All these ways we do to demonstrate that we believe in God, that we trust God, that whatever God is doing in our lives, that we know it's for the better. So, here's the final question to our series. How does one overcome their hurtful past? We don't want to live the rest of our lives with fresh scars and pains. And the hurts are real. We're not saying they're not real. They're real. But how do we become an overcomer in that area of our life? Here's a few things. Number 1, keep your faith strong in God. and live in your faith. Find as many ways as you can to demonstrate your faith in God through that little list that I just gave you. Number 2, recognize God's hand moving in your life to bring you to the place that He wants you to be, or to make you the person that He wants you to be. Because none of us are that person yet. We're not. God is always going to be working in our lives. I know He works in my lives, and sometimes I learn the lesson, and sometimes I'm kind of stubborn, and I don't. And He brings me through it over and over and over. You know, it's like you don't move on to the next lesson until you learn the one that you're in. We've got to realize that the Christian life is a journey of learning. It's really what it is. It's a journey of learning. And if you want to keep getting fresh lessons, we have to learn the lessons that we're in. Okay? So what did I say we need to do? Keep your faith strong in God and live in that faith. Recognize God's hand moving in you to bring you to where He wants you to be. And then thirdly, let hardships be your best teacher. Let hardships be the things that are what? That are changing you. Try to see God's hand in that difficult time. Try to see God working and moving, doing the work on the inside of you. That God can make you that brand new creation that He wants us all to be. Because it's at that point, that's when we really begin to glorify God. Well, that's it. This time went by quick. Thanks for tuning in, and think about that, and I'll see you tomorrow for more of New Hope Radio.